So, what is Rachel's reason for rejecting this cultural differences argument? Well, one reason that he offers for rejecting it is that he thinks the argument is invalid. That is, the logical structure, the underlying relationships between content elements in the argument do not guarantee that the conclusion is true, even if the premises are true. So, he wants to argue that the cultural differences argument is an invalid argument. It's logically flawed. He also wants to argue it has false premises, though it's flawed in both its logical content and in its logical form. He's also going to want to offer up an independent argument against metaethical moral relativism, an argument that takes assumptions and tries to conclude that metaethical moral relativism is false. So how does he go about arguing for the invalidity of this cultural differences argument? Well, he does it by giving us the same counterexample that he offered up against the argument for moral skepticism that we considered earlier. So he's going to give us an argument where it's clear that the premises are true and it's clear that the conclusion is false, and the logical structure of those arguments is the same, the cultural differences argument and this argument, so that we can see that it's possible for the premises of the cultural differences argument to be true without guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. So he asked us to consider the following argument that has the same logical form as his simple version of the cultural differences argument. So he says, premise one, some societies believe the earth is flat. This has been true in the past. I don't know that it's actually true now, but it's certainly true that some societies at some point in time have believed that the earth is flat. Some societies believe the earth is a sphere. And this is true, actually. Ancient Greek societies believe that the earth is a sphere. Certainly we do today. All right, so we have two true premises that are descriptions of beliefs about societies at various points in time. Conclusion. The correct belief about the Earth's shape depends upon the culture in which you find yourself. So the geographical version of moral relativism here. Right? And this is clearly a false conclusion. And so we can see that the premises of the cultural differences argument can be true without guaranteeing that its conclusion is true. By looking at this counterexample, it has the same logical form as the cultural differences argument. Its premises are obviously true, and its conclusion is obviously false. So we see that the logical form of both arguments is flawed. But he also wants to deny the truth of a couple of the premises in that argument. And so I point to two premises in the longer version of the argument that I give here in the lecture, the second and the third premise of that argument. And Rachel wants to argue that differences in moral code are not obviously and clearly indications of different and irreconcilable moral values. That moral codes emerge through a combination of factors. They include moral values, but they also include other features of a particular society. And thus, mere differences in moral code doesn't guarantee that there are different and irreconcilable moral values behind those differences in the moral codes. So he's going to have two strategies for rejecting those two premises in our argument. On the one hand, he's going to want to argue that other factors, religious beliefs, social historical facts, environmental conditions, etc., those have in fact generated differences in moral codes, not necessarily different moral values. So he's going to go back through and look at the example of those indigenous people in the circumpolar regions and their moral code that allows for infanticide versus the Europeans. And he wants to then argue that in the sorts of cases that we find when we look at descriptive cultural relativism, descriptive moral relativism, other factors adequately explain the differences in moral codes without us having to suppose that those cultures in fact have different moral values. So it's at least possible that there are shared moral values across these different cultures despite the fact that they have different moral practices, different moral codes. So to illustrate this in a concrete way, right, in a way that has radically different moral codes, right, he's going to go back through and look at this group of individuals that was once called Eskimos. And this is the general name that's applied to the indigenous inhabitants of the circumpolar areas of North America and the northeastern tip of Siberia, including areas of the United States, of Canada, the USSR, and Greenland. And Eskimo population is currently estimated at about 90,000. It's comprised largely of Inuit in the northern Alaska, Canada, and Greenland areas, and Yupik in western Alaska and Russia, Far East circumpolar peoples. Though there was some contact with these groups dating back to the 16th century, they lived in relatively small and isolated settlements. And it wasn't really until the early 1800s when accounts of their customs became widely known among Europeans and people in North America. Among the striking differences between these Eskimo peoples and Western European and Northern American moral codes was the fairly widespread acceptance, at least at that time, of the practice of infanticide, and particularly infanticide with regard to female babies. So, if we want to follow the meta-ethical moral relativist, the conclusion that we want to draw here is that Eskimos don't share the Western value of, that is the moral value, of the intrinsic value of human life. Thus, the only sense of right or wrong that we can use to make sense of these different practices is tied to the specific moral values of the cultures themselves. Those moral values differ, they're irreconcilable rationally, and hence the only way to understand the judgments as being true or false, the codes as being normative in nature, correct or incorrect moral codes, is relative to the cultures and the values endemic to those cultures. But Rachel wants to argue that that would be a mistake. And he thinks that you can discover sort of two general reasons that a difference in moral codes between these indigenous people and the people of Western European societies and the settlers in North America from those European societies probably doesn't indicate a difference in moral values. And so he's going to give us a couple of reasons. And the first reason is that many societies have practiced infanticide, including societies in India, in China, in Japan, as well as in the cradles of Western civilization, the Greeks and the Romans. In fact, infanticide and infant abandonment occurred throughout Europe, despite Christian prohibitions against it. Its frequency increased in the 14th century during the Black Plague, and it became a widespread problem in the 18th century, which was an age of rapid population growth. And in the 18th and 19th century, when servants weren't permitted to marry or have children, many servant girls or women were forced to kill or abandon their infants, who were often fathered by their employers. So we see that a prohibition against infanticide isn't a universal prohibition. It certainly isn't a prohibition that's always held true, even in Western European societies. So in the next segment, we'll look at that second reason that he offers up to suppose that differences in moral codes between these two different cultures doesn't necessarily indicate a difference in moral values.